Hello, everybody. My name is Celeste Hanna, and I'm excited to give you all an overview today of Italian wine. Hopefully, this presentation can help you do things like demystify what you might be reading on a wine label. You can learn a bit more about Italian wine history and how it informs the culture today. So, first, let's start with a fun fact. Italy actually produces more wine than any other country in the world. In 2019, for example, they produced 47.5 hectoliters of wine, which is about double what the US produced. That equates to about 6 billion bottles of wine. So as you can see in the map here, Italy is split into 20 different regions. Each region does produce some level of wine, but there are a few that are particularly famous for it, those being Piedmont, Tuscany, and Veneto. So as you can see, they're all in the northern half of Italy, and we'll talk a little bit later about the specific types of wines you may expect from these regions. Grape diversity is also very significant in Italy. So there are over 3,000 types of grape varietals, which really just mean types of grapes that are used to make wine, and about 350 are used in commercial production, compared to just 35 in France and 20 in Spain. So that means the type of grapes that could be in the possible wine you're drinking are huge in variety. And then in 2019, Italy was actually voted the #1 country to visit for wine lovers. And with some of these stats we've already talked about, it's not super surprising to see that. So before we go into wine and modern Italian sort of culture, I think it's important to understand the history so we can see how we got here today. So, wine has been grown in Italy for more than 4,000 years. Evidence suggests that in 2000 BC, prehistoric people were cultivating wild grapes at that time. In 800 BC, the Greeks started to immigrate to southern Italy, and they were so sort of um, taken aback with how well that wine vines grew there that they actually decided to name it Land of the Wine. Then during the Roman Empire, this is when things really started to take off at first for wine production in Italy. So large-scale plantations were built all over the country. Unfortunately, a lot of them were primarily run on slave labor at the time. In fact, wine was so popular that in 92 AD, the emperor at the time actually had to destroy a significant amount of crops in order to make room for food production. So you can see how ingrained it was in the culture. Although they were growing a lot of wine at this time, it looked very different than it does in the modern world. The wine was a lot stronger, so it was often diluted with water, and also mixed with spices, herbs, even chalk, salt, honey, to adjust the flavor. Even though the wine tasted and looked different, the Romans did contribute to some modern winemaking practices during this time. They were the first to realize that aged wine typically tastes better than wine straight off the grapes. So they were the first to age wine in barrels. They also started classifying certain types of grapes and using juice presses. Um, Also during this time, it was technically illegal to produce wine outside of Italy. So the Romans were using this as a trade advantage, if you will, where they would export wine to other parts of Europe in exchange for slaves or other imports. In fact, we have Bacchus here, the Roman guide of fruitfulness, vegetation, maybe a little bit of hedonism, and wine. So you can see that wine was so important to the Romans that they even named a god after it. Moving forward, the popularity of wine sort of did rise and fall with the Roman Empire. During the Dark Ages, really the only folks who were producing wine were Christian monks. This changed again during the Renaissance, however, and interest in wine really skyrocketed again. And some of the vineyards that are famous today were first cultivated during this time. Unfortunately, again, during the 1800s, there was a major vine louse outbreak, which was essentially a pest. This was happening all throughout Europe, not just Italy, and this pest destroyed a lot of the sort of ancient famous vines. In the early 1900s, Italy was sort of still struggling to recover from this outbreak. They were producing wine, but generally it was considered sort of lower quality table wine, and they weren't a major player in the wine distribution system at the time. During the 1960s, the Italian government decided they wanted to change this. They wanted to restore Italy's prestigious reputation. And in partnership with doing this, they implemented this classification system that is still used today. So let's talk about that classification system. So in 1963, the government rolled out this labeling standard where essentially wines that came from a specific region and met quality standards and grape varietal standards were labeled DOC. There are certain Italian words I'm not going to attempt to pronounce throughout this presentation. That is one of them, but DOC essentially translates to destination of origin. So it means that any wine labeled with DOC technically comes from a region, technically a sub-region within Italy. So for example, Barolo wine comes from the region of Italy, but Barolo is technically a sub-region. It can almost be thought of as a county. It's made up of 5 or 6 towns. But wine cannot be labeled Barolo unless it comes from this region and is grown from the specific grape varietals that are required of that type of wine. We'll talk about more of that later. In 1980, the DOCG classification system was added, which is essentially an even higher quality standard. It means guaranteed destination of origin. So it still needs to meet all of the requirements of DOC, but also has growing rules. It needs to pass quality tasting panels, etc. So typically, and this still stands true today, DOCG and DOC wines are considered the highest quality in Italy. There are certain exceptions, but basically the government is guaranteeing that the wine you are drinking, if it's labeled as such, is both from a certain region and meets certain grape varieties. So you know exactly what you're drinking and where it comes from. Typically, these wines are going to be labeled with the DOC or DOCG designation, as well as have it written on a paper band around the cork, as you can see in some of the pictures here. So in total, there are technically 4 wine classifications that you may see in Italy. So we talked about the first 2, DOCG, which is sort of the highest quality, but highest restriction designation. There are a total of 74 DOCG wines in Italy, with the last being added over 10 years ago in 2011. DOC, there are 334 of those wines. And then the next we have the IGT wine. This wine, basically what IGT translates to is typical geographical indication. So that means this wine is still coming from a region or sub-region in Italy, but it doesn't follow strict craft and grape requirements in the same way as DOC and DOCG. So it sort of is a little bit more open-ended and leaves more creativity, or allows the producers to be more creative as they're producing these wines. And then last we have VDT wines, which technically translates to table wine. These wines are made of grapes from anywhere in Italy, can be sourced from multiple regions. Typically this is like the house wine you may see at a restaurant, and it's not regularly distributed outside of Italy. So let's now dive into the specific regions in Italy and talk about what you might expect in each of those. So first we have Piedmont. Piedmont is a beautiful area in the northwestern part of Italy. It's a mountainous region that meets the Mediterranean, which creates a really healthy climate for red grapes in particular. You'll find a lot of small family-owned vineyards here. And it's technically the #1 destination for DOCG wines. So 17 different types of DOCG wines are produced here. As I mentioned, red grapes thrive here, particularly the Nebbiolo grape. And the Nebbiolo grape makes up of 2 of the most famous DOCG wines, not just in the region, but in all of Italy. So the first is called Barolo, which is often called the wine of kings and the king of wine. This wine is very famous with collectors, typically can come at a higher price point. requires a minimum of 3 to 5 years typically of aging to reach its full flavor potential. So it's something you may often find in like the basement of a collector's house. They're waiting for it to age and be ready to drink. Next door to Barolo is Barbaresco, another DOCG wine, often called the Queen of Wines. It's also made of 100% Nebbiolo, but even though it's made of the same grapes as Barolo, the way it's grown and the difference in climates between these two subregions really do create distinct flavor characteristics. Even though this area is known for red wine particularly, there are some high quality wines, white wines also derived from Cortese, Arnese, and Moscato Bianco grapes. So those are worth checking out as well. Next, let's talk about Veneto. So Veneto is a region in the northeastern part of Italy, technically the region that Venice exists in. But this region is unique in that we have the Alps to the north, Lake Garda to the west, and the Adriatic Sea to the southeast. So the climate is very diverse and creates a lot of microclimates that allows a very diverse set of grapes to grow. So you'll find a lot of different types of grapes in this region specifically. They have 14 DOCG wines, but some of the varietals that have made this area most famous are Prosecco and Pinot Grigio. If everything I've said up to this point has not made sense to someone, maybe the word Prosecco rings a bell. It's a very popular sparkling wine. It's one of the main ingredients in the famous Aperol Spritz and Aperitivo that people will usually have in the afternoon. And there are also some Prosecco hills in this area that are a UNESCO World Heritage Site. They're actually pictured here on the left. So they're one of the 2 only vineyards in Italy that have this designation, which is pretty cool. But as you can see here, there are plenty of wines to explore, some awesome DOC and DOCG designations that come from these different regions here. So check out, Bardolino, Soave, Lugana, etc. Next, we're going to talk about Tuscany. So Tuscany is on the sort of western part of Italy. It's met with these beautiful rolling hills that meet the Tyrrhenian Sea. And this region is also known particularly for red wine, most of which is derived from the Sangiovese grape. So this grape is used in Chianti, Brunello del Montalcino DOCG wine, and more. This area has 11 DOCG wines, but is also known for its Super Tuscan IGT wines. So if you recall, IGT was sort of that third classification that doesn't typically have as strict of grape varietal requirements. Super Tuscans are one of those sort of exceptions to the rules where some of these wines are considered higher, if not at the same quality, even higher quality than some DOCG and DOC wines. For that reason, they can often be sold at a pretty high price point, but will generally be blends of multiple grapes like Sangiovese, Cabernet Sauvignon, Syrah, and Merlot. And then if you're a white wine lover, a great honorable mention for this area is Vernaccia di San Gimignano, which is a DOCG wine that is lovely. All right, last but not least, I also wanted to highlight the Lombardy region, which is where Brescia is. So similar to Veneto, Lombardy also is bordered by the Alps, which leads to sort of a cooling influence. And this region is really a breeding ground or a mecca for sparkling wine in particular. So this region has 5 different DOCG wines. But the most prestigious or famous is the Franciacorta DOCG wine, which is actually made in the province of Brescia. It's a combination of Chardonnay, Pinot Bianco, and Pinot Nero grapes. But it's definitely something you'll be able to find locally in Brescia and highly recommend giving it a try. Okay, so there's been a lot of, a lot of verbiage thrown around here and a lot to digest. And I just want to be clear that everyone understands sort of the different variables that come into play with Italian wine. So first there's the region. So for example, Piedmont, Tuscany, Veneto. Then we have the wine appellation, which is I've sometimes been calling a subregion. So one example I'll go back to is Barolo. Barolo can again be sort of considered a county within the Piedmont region. It's made up of 5 of 6 towns, and Barolo can only be made in this area. But the appellation is typically what you're going to see on the label. In fact, that'll probably be one of the biggest things you'll see on the label is the appellation. Yeah. Then there's the classification, DOCG, DOC, etc. Then the grapes that wine is made up of specifically, and then producers, which are the different families or winemakers actually making that wine. So I want to be sure that everyone understands the relationship between these variables. So I'm just going to go through a few examples. So we'll go back to the region of Piedmont again. In Piedmont, there are, this is by no means cumulative, but a few examples of appellations that exist in Piedmont are Barolo, like we've talked about, Langhe Arnaise, and Barbaresco. So these are the subregions / the type of wine designation and often what you'll read on the label. So then each of these wines has a set classification. So Barolo's DOCG, Langhe Arnaise is DOC, etc. And each of those wines is made up of specific grapes. So DOC and DOCG wines have strict requirements on the type of grapes that can go in that wine. So if someone was labeling a wine that only was made up of 85% Nebbiolo, a Barolo, the government would step in and say, you cannot label that wine in that manner. As you can see, things do easily get tricky here. The Langhe Arnaise is the grape. Langhe is the region. Often with wines that aren't necessarily designated DOCG, you may also see the name of the grape on the label. It can get complex, but again, this is generally how it works. But now let's talk about the producers. So when I'm talking about Barolo, for example, that doesn't mean that just there's only one Barolo on the market. It means that there can be a bunch of different winemakers in that region that are making Barolo. So in this example here, you can see this winemaker makes Barolo and Langhe Arnaise. This producer makes just Barolo, etc. And so that's really where it's up to you to try out different producers, see what you like, see the different flavors. And if you have the opportunity to visit some of these producers, you can really hear their story and understand how their vineyard maybe differs from their neighbors and how that can impact the flavor characteristics. Let's just do a few more examples to make sure all of this is clear. So we have a few more regions here, and then a few wine appellations that come from those regions. So Tuscany, we have Brunello di Montalcino and Chianti, whereas we have Franciacorta coming from Lombardy. And then we have the classifications, as we've discussed, and the grapes. So a few things I'll highlight here. Chianti is an IGT wine. So a Chianti has to be made of at least 80% Sangiovese grapes. But again, this one is not as strict. It could be more. It can be just 80 because it's not a DOC or DOCG wine. I also want to make it clear that not all DOCG wines need to be made up of one grape. Franciacorta is an example. It has to be made instead of 85% Chardonnay, 10% Pinot Nero, and 5% Pinot Blanco. So the varietals required in a given DOCG or DOC wine is dependent on the region and dependent on the specific wine itself. Okay, so now let's just go through a few sort of things to highlight about wine and Italian culture today. So if it hasn't already been demonstrated through previous parts of this presentation, wine is very integral to the culture in general in Italy. It's not uncommon to see an Italian having a glass of wine in the afternoon or with dinner. In fact, the average Italian drinks about 37 liters or 49 bottles of wine each year, so about a bottle a week. In addition, about 1 in 50 Italians also participates in the grape harvesting season every year. So that just further demonstrates how sort of ingrained this is in Italian culture if 1 in 50 people is helping pick the grapes every year. I also sort of alluded to this, but you will find a lot of family-run winemakers in Italy, particularly in the Piedmont region. And these folks, they really live and breathe this the wine that they make, and it's really their history and their culture. Often there'll be multi-generational families where their grandfather was also making the wine, and their children will start learning at a young age to potentially take over the winery. And it's really incredible if you have the opportunity to visit some of these wineries and hear their stories. And really see what makes their wine distinct. So definitely try to support small local winemakers in Italy whenever you have the opportunity to. Another thing is, unfortunately, Italy, as well as many European countries, has not emerged unscathed from climate change. In recent years, specifically, Europe has been hit really hard by things like hail, fire, pest, disease. And so overall yield has really been impacted. They just can't make as much wine because the weather is, ruining some of their crops. So just another thing to keep in mind, supporting these small businesses when they may not be able to supply as much wine in recent years. All right, so then I'm going to leave things off with a few recommendations from a sommelier. So my interest in wine is not just a personal one. My father is actually involved in wine, and I've had the opportunity to sometimes, tag along and learn from him. So I asked him to email me 5 recommendations just for all of us while we're in Italy, if you're looking to check out some different options. So the first one he recommended is Barolo, produced by the Asheri family. So we've talked a lot about Barolo. As we know, it's made from the grape Nebbiolo, which he said, think nebulous weather, which I thought was kind of a cool way to think about it. But this Asheri wine particularly is a little bit more accessible. It doesn't have a crazy high price point and doesn't always meet the same aging requirements as some other Barolos do, so it can be drinkable earlier. This wine comes from the small town of Bra, where the slow food movement originated. It's sort of similar to a farm to table concept, eating local, etc. And Nutella also comes from here. This is one of those family-owned wineries, small business. They have a cool little hotel at the top of their winery, and then their sister owns a restaurant across the street. So definitely a very cool small business to support. And as he says, fun and delicious. All right, next let's talk about German Tunina. So it may also have been alluded to in this presentation, but often when collectors are thinking about quality Italian wine, their mind immediately goes to red. But there are a lot of great white wines in Italy as well. And this is one of the examples of that. This wine comes from the Veneto region. And it's a blend of multiple grapes that really yields rich stone fruit flavors, complexity, and is just a really great try. All right, thirdly, we're going to go close to home for those of us going to Brescia. We have the Antica Frata Franciacorta Rosé. So this is from the shores of the lake Iseo in Lombardy, and it's some of Italy's best sparkling wine. This wine is made in a very similar way to champagne that's made in France. The only difference being that they use Pinot Bianco in place of Pinot Meunier grapes. And this wine particularly always is vintage dated. And what that means is all of the grapes are coming from the same year. That's common with other types of wine, but not common particularly with sparkling wine. So it's just a further designation of the quality of this Franciacorta specifically. So again, will definitely be accessible during our time in Brescia and worth a try. Okay, next we have the Altesino Brunello de Montalcino Montezilli. A little tongue-tied there. But this wine is from one of the most famous villages in Tuscany, Montalcino. It's made from a Sangiovese Grosso clone of Sangiovese, and it's just known to having consistently really good wine each vintage. So also a red that's definitely worth a try. And last but not least, we have the Tornatore Etna Rosso. This is sometimes called the Burgundy of the Mediterranean, which Burgundy is a region in France that's very famous for Pinot Noir wines, very quality wines. So this wine originates from Sicily. It's a very easy drinking, kind of casual summer wine, great for a glass of wine in the afternoon. Okay, so I have covered a lot of content here, but hopefully this information was helpful and again can sort of demystify, at least to some extent, Italian wine and help you learn more about how ingrained this is in the history and culture today in Italy. I'll just flash the works cited and thank you so much.